So my name is Colleen Thouez. I have spent decades working with governments at the national level and at the United Nations, often bringing to bear the importance of including city government in decisions that are being made around issues like sustainable development and, more recently, immigration and refugee protection. I'm happy to say that there is a more open spirit among many national governments to understand that they need to be informed by city government and to inform city government of the deliberations, the discussions, and the decisions that they're making. Part of that work that I've been doing on working with national governments and saying, listen, look at your local leaders for some of the solutions, or at least for honest conversations around the real challenges. Part of the work has also been to advocate so that city governments can have a direct representation, a self-representation in decisions that have direct bearing on their own governing at the local level, meaning that cities in this field of immigration writ large, which of course includes refugee protection, just as in other fields like climate change, that cities have a right. Indeed, cities have an obligation to be at the table when national governments are making decisions about how to advance quickly, efficiently, effectively in these policy areas. So now, without further ado, let me say a few words about how we will conduct the conversation here this morning. The overall theme of this session is city leadership, both in the face of very difficult or growing, increasingly difficult political contexts, both nationally and internationally, and some of the work that cities are doing in terms of forging partnerships with members of the private sector, business community, I'm sure who are represented here in our audience and some around the table as well, and with the Philanthropic Foundation and many others. The conversation will begin with, in a first part, looking at the politics. We will have a very distinguished set of mayors who are here who will continue the conversation that we started in the plenary. We have Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms from the City of Atlanta, Mayor Yvonne Aki-Sawyerr from the City of Freetown, Sierra Leone, and the Mayor of Kampala, Uganda, Mayor Lukwago, who we had the pleasure of having with us last year when we hosted with the Mayor of New York City here during the Concordia Summit, a first gathering of mayors on this issue of migration and refugee protection. So we'll start the conversation with a few reflections from the mayors on the conversation this morning, what they see as the big challenges ahead for their city as a city, and also vis-a-vis the political situation at the national level, and why not also at the regional, continental level. And then we will follow in a second instance with a conversation with a number of city governments and partners to city government who are around the table on the responses to the growing vulnerability of, in some cases, undocumented migrants, refugees, and others who are in cities, in city jurisdictions, and some of the mobilization of cities internationally, in this case, in the face of the negotiations and the agreement of two so-called compacts that states will be endorsing at the end of this year, known as the Global Compact on Migration, which often we hear of as a historic agreement in the sense it's the only international agreement, it's not binding, only international agreement by states to understand how they can better cooperate on migration policy. And there is another agreement that that states will be signing off on around refugee protection. And both of those will come to fruition at the end of the year. And as I say, over the course of this year, 2018, cities have been very vocal and indeed very effective in the contents of those agreements by states. So again, influencing states' perceptions on what needs to happen, what the problem is, and where some of the solutions will be coming from. The third and final part of our discussion today will be on the operations, if we can call it on that, on some of the initiatives, partnerships that city governments and partners of city governments, be it from the private sector, from the philanthropic sector, are engaging in some of the innovations, and really with a mind or a view to making some asks, some very concrete asks from the audience and from the others around the table, so that we can bring to a head the political influence, the material, financial resources that we can mobilize, and so that we can really make a difference in supporting city governments and the good work that they're doing. So without further ado, let me first pass the floor to the Mayor of Atlanta, Mayor Bottoms, for a few reflections, please.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon. It's such an honor to join such a distinguished panel and to be here. As we spoke this morning, there is a quote from one of my favorite writers, Audre Lorde, that kept playing in my mind, and it was that revolution is not a one-time event. And I think of that often, especially in the work that we are doing throughout our various cities in ways that may seem to be small in scale, but really are part of a larger conversation and a larger revolution, if you will, as it relates to how we address our issues of immigration and migration. Atlanta is well known as the birthplace of the civil rights movement, and I think it's a great example of how small actions really can change the world. When we see the role that Atlanta, and specifically Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., played in the civil rights movement, it really was a series of decisions, intentional decisions, that eventually influenced national policy. And from my viewpoint, that's no different than the discussion we are having with the roles that cities will play and local leadership will play as it relates to immigration and migration. We are the closest to the ground and understand the needs and the wants of our communities in a way that really just cannot be understood on a national level. And so I'm honored to join you all and look forward to hearing more from each of you on what it is that's happening in your respective areas and how we can continue to work together to make a difference and really create a revolution that will change the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor Bottoms. We'll withhold any clapping, applaud during this conversation. Thank you for those words of inspiration, and we'll turn now to the Mayor of Freetown.
Thank you, Colleen. And yes, indeed, it's a pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to speak collectively about the role that cities can play. I was saying earlier on today in a conversation with Colleen that one of the things that distinguishes us as mayors, as city leaders, is that we think about those who live in our cities not as citizens, but as our residents, people for whom we have responsibility. So we're not concerned about your passport or, where you were born, etc. You live in our city, therefore you are our constituent. So the same responsibility that we have to those constituents in respect of issues around poverty, in respect of issues around climate change, vulnerability, all of those things come to play in the context of migration. So in some ways, it's a very strange question to ask about the role of cities taking leadership in with regards to migration, because it's impacting our residents. Whether you're on my side of the Atlantic and citizens are leaving your shores, or you're on this side of the Atlantic and residents are coming to your shores, whether they're leaving or coming, at some level, they're your responsibility. So our leadership really is key. A comment that's been made, which I just want to reiterate, is the fact that at the city level, we're closest to the action. So these aren't statistics. As many mayors in the room, I'm sure, would experience, you walk the streets. You engage with schools, you engage with hospitals, you engage with families who many times in my situation are grieving because of the death, unfortunate death of citizens or residents rather, trying to make that journey of migration. So I think I'd just like to conclude by saying the question of leadership, I feel, is almost a given. This is our responsibility, and it's behoven of us to be very involved. We also have the privilege of being closest to the ground and understanding the drivers. So we're best placed, really, to be part of the conversation about creating the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mayor Aki-Sawyerr. This question of responsibility for the people in one's city, I think, is a part of the revolution to which Mayor Bottoms was alluding a few moments ago, because I can assure you, and some others who are either from government, national government, or who work closely with them, will let you know that there is still a very strong push to make distinctions between different categories of people. Now, while that may be at issue at national borders, it can't be at issue within city borders. And it's messy, it's complicated, and yet we need to face it head on, and cities are doing that. So I hope we'll have more of a conversation to speak about that. And now I pass to the Mayor of Kampala, Mayor Lukwago, Honorable Mayor Lukwago.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure being part of this very wonderful conversation. I am Lukwago Erias, the Lord Mayor of Kampala. On broader perspectives, yes, I welcome the idea of bringing the mayors or state leaders at the forefront of this conversation, because many times we are at the receiving end of the vagaries of these issues. And of course, at times when you are coming up with the national, international policies, we're not so much considered, but we play a central role. And this is critical. In my city, Kampala, you have about 5 million people, the business community. 5 million people in a country of about 35 million people. And as a country, we have an open door policy in as far as the issue of refugees is concerned. And even actually when it comes to immigrants, it's an open market. It's a free economy. But hardly do you find policies at a city level where you have to deal with these issues. You have these people exerting pressures on the facilities you have, on the utilities you have, but there is little that you can generate as the local leadership there to address these critical challenges. So when this idea, which is being mooted, of coming up with a platform, the Mayors, Migrants Council, we will embrace it, because it is going to create a platform for us. It's going to create a forum for us to influence national and international policies and the decision-making processes. And that is very central in the way we expect to execute our duties. Finally, the idea of civil liberties, and as highlighted by the mayor of Atlanta, is equally important when it comes to dealing with the drivers of these issues. Again, at times we lose sight of this fact. We tend to address the consequences, not the causes. And this creates problems for us. I come from a country which is centrally located within the Great Lakes region. And it is political conflicts all over. Actually, I can talk about at a continental level. We tend to shy away from the real issues of the democracy deficits in our countries, which is a key driver of this issue of the refugees. In Uganda, for example, we have about 1.4 million refugees now. 1.4 million refugees. Imagine a population of about 35 million people. You have 1.4 million refugees coming from as far as Eritrea, South Sudan, Somalia. You know what is happening in Somalia, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, and quite a number of other countries. Yet, the political stability in my own country is also not guaranteed. The host country, we're also sitting on a time bomb. So this is a huge challenge. So actually, I'm imagining that if those issues, those drivers are not addressed, and my country also explodes because of the deficit of democracy, respect for human rights and civil liberties, what's going to happen to these people who are running away from fire, running away from a frying pan, jumping into fire? It's terrible. So we need to address our minds to those critical issues and chart a way forward. That's why I welcome the idea of creating a forum for us as city leaders to see how we are going to address these challenges. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor Kumpala, Mayor Lukwago. You've brought up the question of regional instability, and we often think about Africa in that context, but certainly many people who are looking to the southern border here in the United States, we don't speak enough about the instability and the violence in Central America, certainly. And we will hear a little bit more about the reactions and some of the responses being taken at the national level by our next set of speakers, who I understand. So sorry, just coming back, in terms of how we'll proceed, I will call on some of you. We've had some conversations around the very interesting perspectives that you all will bring. If anybody who I don't call on, who feels that they really want to interject at one point, have a direct question or comment for one of the speakers, please put up your placard and I will call on you. But let's start with New York City. We're expecting the Commissioner for Immigrant Affairs, and we're very happy to, sorry to hear that she won't be with us, but very happy that her Chief of Staff is with us. And we're also joined by Georgette Mulher, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Lumos Foundation, and she may say a few words about the foundation. Both the Commissioner for New York City and Ms. Mulher from the Lumos Foundation were just recently at the largest detention center, migrant detention center, located in southern Texas, known as the Dilley Center. And we will hear a little bit about that visit, and then perhaps also about what you're going to be doing with what you saw there in terms of advocacy work at the federal level. Thank you very much. So I pass it both to Lumos and to New York City.
Thank you so much, Colleen. My name is Leora Danan. I'm the Chief of Staff for the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. The mission of our office is to promote the well-being of immigrant New Yorkers through inclusive policies and programs. As you all know, New York City is an incredibly diverse city, and we strive for inclusivity. All of our city services are available to all New Yorkers, regardless of their immigration status. That includes education, access to healthcare, our municipal ID program, and emergency food and shelter. Facilitating access to justice is also a major priority for Mayor de Blasio, which is why he's made an unprecedented commitment of $30 million to immigration legal services. In addition to our local work, we are often working through a national coalition, Cities for Action. We have 175 mayors and county executives around the country working on a shared pro-immigrant agenda, and we have several of our city partners around the table here, Atlanta, LA, and Chicago. We have also increasingly been working with cities around the world, including working together to advocate for the inclusion of local authorities in the text of the Global Compact on Migration. And we will be meeting again this week to think about the next steps, working with cities from around the globe and other key experts to think about how cities can engage in the implementation, follow-up, and review phases of the GCM. We know we have a lot to offer in this space because we live the implementation in our daily work and have direct knowledge and expertise from that day-to-day to inform these efforts. What we've found is that we can be much more powerful when we're working together. And the effects we feel locally, but we know that the challenges, which are enormous, are at the national scale, and require collective action. Even just in the US this weekend, for example, the administration announced a new proposal, a change to who may be deemed a public charge for immigration purposes. If it goes into effect, it could deny visas and green cards to anyone who has used any one of an array of public benefits, including nutrition assistance, subsidized healthcare and housing assistance, or those who are deemed likely to use those in the future. So this rule has not gone into effect, but even so, mayors around the country are already speaking out against it because we know it will harm our communities and our economies, and that we'll have to act together to protect them. I'm going to give just one example of the ways in which cities have been working locally and collectively when confronted with a wide-scale migration challenge, and this will connect to the work that we've been doing with Georgette and with the Lumos Foundation. So this past spring and summer, as you all know, the US government started a zero-tolerance policy of criminally prosecuting all adults apprehended at the southwest US border during unauthorized crossing of the southwest US border. And they were separated from the children accompanying them, 2,600 of them, and creating a national immigrant family separation crisis. Our mayor, dozens of others around the country quickly spoke out against family separation. Here in New York City, the de Blasio administration moved very swiftly to support the approximately 300 children that were here in New York City, and many of them thousands of miles from their parents, many of them very young children. Our office worked with city agencies, our sister agencies here in the city to lead a coordinated response, providing health, mental health, legal help, and recreational supports for these children using our pre-existing programs and partnerships in the city. We also just announced that the city is allocating $4.1 million for legal representation for migrant children who are facing deportation proceedings. New York City was obviously not alone in these efforts. Other cities organized local responses to family separation, including legal support and other types of direct assistance. And Cities for Action partnered with the Lumos Foundation to jointly develop a report, which we have in hard copy today, about their, on local responses to the crisis and best practice in assisting separated families, which the Lumos Foundation is expert in. So obviously Georgette will speak more to their work and to the partnership in just a minute. Our joint report looks at case studies from New York, LA, and San Antonio, and how local governments took action to support separated families during the crisis. But this is not just about looking back, and as Georgette can speak further to, she will be traveling with our commissioner to DC this evening to speak on the Hill tomorrow to share this information, because we want policymakers to understand that the harms of family separation practices and that family detention is not a viable alternative. So, family separation is really just one example of where local governments have recently served as a pragmatic local responder, first responder to promote public safety, ensure that our immigrant residents have accurate information, to enable and support immigrants with opportunities for full inclusion in our cities. We know we're on the front lines in this work, and we are eager to keep working together and to build new partnerships to work for the rights and dignity of migrants around the world.
Thank you, Leora. And thank you very much for inviting us to this today. The city responses, and I say this as an Irish/British person, more Irish than British these days. I think you can probably understand why. That the city's response in the United States, in my opinion, has been absolutely extraordinary. We have a huge refugee crisis in Europe at the moment, as you well know, and we are not responding in this way. I'm not saying there isn't some good response, but the joined-up responses and the positive approach to immigrants, very similar to what the Mayor of Freetown and the Mayor of Kampala was saying, is really not the case in Europe. I'm not saying that it's the case everywhere here either, but really what you've done is quite extraordinary, and the leadership that you've taken is amazing. And it's been really humbling for us to watch, and I feel like Europe's got a lot to learn from the United States on this. I'm sure a lot of my European colleagues would be very uncomfortable with that, but I think it's true. The other thing that happened was, so when we connected with the Mayor's office here, Lumos is a global organisation that works to end the institutionalisation of children around the world, and that includes refugee and migrant children. And we work in many countries. I won't tell you about that, but because we have a small presence in the US, when the family separation crisis happened, we thought maybe there was something useful we could do. Because the US largely moved away from institutionalising children decades ago, we kind of felt we might have some expertise on things that is sort of forgotten here, really, is what do you do when you've got mass institutionalisation of children? How do you address the harmful effects of institutionalisation and so on? And I think what has been, so there has been a great partnership, immediate partnership with the Mayor of New York and with Cities for Action, putting together the report that hopefully will be helpful to others thinking about how to respond. But at the same time as that, the City of New York put us in contact with a number of different organisations, and we, through that, have put in place some gap filling. We've been helping legal defence organisations, grassroots organisations who've mobilised, organisations that work on cross-border reunification and so on, and we're doing some of that work. Within that, I visited the so-called South Texas Family Residential Center, which sounds really fluffy and lovely, doesn't it, in Dilley, Texas, last weekend, and it's a prison. It's essentially a prison. I think a number of the things that for me were really important, I saw families, mothers and children together, who are being detained together, but they've only been detained maybe for a week or two. And although they're in prison, and although it's horrible, that protection that the mothers are giving the children means that the kids are doing not too badly, apart from they're not getting medical care. But in terms of the levels of trauma, it's not that bad amongst those children. But there's a group of families in there who were the families who were separated and then reunited but put into detention, and they've been there for 4 months. And the stress and the trauma and the behaviours of those children, completely different. So we've actually got this social experiment going on in Dilley that tells people that, one, you don't put families in prison who have done nothing wrong, and two, the longer you keep a child in an institutionalised environment, the more harm you're going to cause. I think one of the things that's missing from the understanding, from what I see, because obviously we follow the press here a lot, is most people, I think, imagine that these are economic migrants. Now, as I say, I'm Irish-British. I'm an economic migrant, okay? So I have nothing against that. However, what was really clear from all of the cases of families that we met was horrific human rights abuses and serious threat of harm that they are fleeing. And when people are criticising these families and are saying, oh, you shouldn't put your child in risk by coming here and trying to get in here illegally, these are families who are protecting their children. These are families who have children who've been gang raped. These are children who have witnessed gangs killing people and know where their bodies are buried and are being threatened because of their knowledge. Every case we spoke to was something of this ilk, and it was sustained years of unspeakable levels of physical and sexual violence against children and women. These are refugees. And we need to understand that, and everybody, I think, in the United States needs to understand the severity of what has happened to these families and should be honouring them for the bravery and the courage of them, that they have, taken this action to protect their children and to get them out of a really, really dangerous environment. Certainly shouldn't be imprisoning them. One of the things that was really important to me and significant to me was we deal with a very similar program in the north of Ethiopia with Eritrean children coming across the border, and it was stunningly similar. Although the prison was a bit prettier in Texas, the system was pretty much the same as the detention system for unaccompanied children and for families in the in the north of Ethiopia. And I think this is the problem, is that people imagine that sometimes poor conditions and poor treatment is about poverty. It's not. It's about mindset and attitude and the way that we treat people and the way we think of them as other, as not as important. And the minute we think it's okay to institutionalize, to detain, to imprison people who have committed no crime, we are going to see harmful results, whether that is in the richest country in the world or one of the poorest. The other thing that we saw, and I think has been so complicated for cities and why they've been so brilliant in responding, is that so many countries create parallel systems. Children who are refugee or migrant children get dealt with by a refugee system, which is a very criminalized and detention-based system, obviously with exceptions. Children who are vulnerable, who are citizens of the country, get dealt with by a child protection system in a very different way. There has to be a way of ensuring that any vulnerable child who is in your country, exactly the same as the Mayor of Freetown was saying, gets treated by the same system, and it's seen as a child protection issue rather than some kind of criminalized response. Final thing I will say on this, I think is very important, is this is a really expensive way of dealing with this. And clearly what's going on is ideological. Because if anyone looks at the maths involved, the amount of money being poured into this system of detaining people who are genuinely refugees and have committed no crime is an illogical thing for any country to do. No country can waste money, and particularly if you've got a fiscally conservative government, it is bizarre to take those sorts of decisions, which shows you that it's ideological and it needs to be fought with data around cost and how much this costs, and that there are alternatives to detention. There are many countries that can teach the US that there are alternatives to detention, but there's also examples in the past here of really good programs that are alternatives to detention, have good outcomes, and do not cost an awful lot of money. So in terms of next steps, one of the most important things in the United States, and I hope that we can get support from other countries around the world to tell us about how you fought similar issues like this, is this idea of indefinite detention of these families and children. At the moment, they can only be detained for 20 days, but they're trying to change the rules so that they can just indefinitely detain these families. This, as I said, the kids who've been detained for 4 months are really traumatized and harmed, and so we've got to make sure that we fight this, stop that from happening, and then actually reverse the policy entirely and show that these families can be dealt with respect and with kindness, and not be detained at all, and go through an asylum process as any other person fleeing persecutions should. So thank you so much for that. And really, I just want to say a huge shout out again to the City of New York and other cities across the United States who've mobilized such an extraordinary response, and to the pro bono lawyers and to the citizens who have just mobilized in a way that I find really humbling. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George and Leora, for that. I'm sure that there are many questions. I think we're just stunned by that testimony of, George, what you saw when you were at the detention center. And I know we'll hear from others. We have a few around the room who are, have been advocating around the very things you've been saying around child protection and child welfare services, similarly around detention and alternatives to detention, but you're putting your finger on the button, and perhaps we can come back to you a little bit later so you could let us know, perhaps, about what your expectations are when you go and speak to the federal government about this and the messages that you'll pass. But now let me pass the floor to the City of Chicago. We have the director of the Office of New Americans for the City of Chicago, who of course is working with a mayor who has held, or who has been, national government has advised the former President of the United States, for those who are unfamiliar, and who can let us know a little bit about what's going on in Chicago. And as we spoke about on the phone, Seemi, you can also tell us about what the City of Chicago needs, what type of support. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me to this esteemed panel group, and it's quite the honor. My name is Seemi Choudry. I'm the director of the Office of New Americans for the City of Chicago, and I myself am an immigrant. My parents are originally from Pakistan, and I was born in Caracas, Venezuela. It's a longer story, but I think that certainly there's sort of a connection here around the importance of those of us who are familiar with the immigration system, are familiar with the process of going through what it means to be a refugee, being displaced, and then serving in the role of a very highly esteemed role of being in public service. And I'm kind of reminded of sort of within the culture that Mayor Lance Bottoms brought us to, of, thinking about for those of us, much is given, much is expected. And with that, I'll share a little bit about what I've done during my tenure here as well, not here, but in the City of Chicago, as the director of the Office of New Americans. So in many ways, we look very closely to our partners who are working in our coastal cities, and Mayor Emanuel has worked, as Dr. Colleen has mentioned earlier, at the senior level as well, in his role for both former President Clinton, former President Obama. In Chicago, we have trouble calling him former president. We still kind of call him Obama, President Obama. So nevertheless, we've looked at the best practices between other cities around how we can be offering legal services, what can we be doing in terms of supporting communities that historically have difficulty getting government-issued IDs. So within my tenure there, we created our first legal protection fund, which serves immigrants and refugees alike, fighting deportation cases, extending, deportation orders, as well as at the very basic level, training immigrants on what their rights are. This is absolutely fundamental, because when we think about what it means to be a welcoming city, oftentimes dubbed a quote-unquote sanctuary city, it's important that everyone is aware at the very rudimentary level, what is your right? And that means that if Immigration and Customs Enforcement shows up at your doorstep, that they must have a judicial warrant, that they don't get free rein to do whatever they want, despite what the president says. And so this is something that has carried over the course of the last couple of years. It's been really remarkable seeing what the work of our partnering organizations have done, what the non-for-profit organizations have done to double down on their efforts through the guidance and leadership of our office and the guidance and leadership of Mayor Emanuel. And so I think it's pretty clear that with the lack of, or in other words, absence of confidence at the presidential level, there's been an increased level of attention, an increased level of sort of a spotlight, rather, on mayors, because again, as the mayors that are here mentioned earlier, folks are looking for some level of reassurance. Our immigrant and refugee populations want to know that if the man as that's in other words called the commander-in-chief, is not supporting them and has made it very clear from the very beginning, before even becoming president, that immigrants and refugees would be his target population, that it's been even more so incumbent upon our mayors to increase in the level of support on a symbolic level, and more importantly, on a policy level towards the immigrant and refugee population. I think it is absolutely crucial that when we think about this sort of phrase of immigrant integration, we're thinking about it at the comprehensive level, because true comprehensive immigrant integration means that a refugee can see themselves in a role of public service, can see themselves in a role of being an engineer, can see themselves in a role of being a CEO of a company, and similarly the same goes with an immigrant. I'll share a story of, for example, the ways in which mayors have played a part of this sort of larger dialogue. One of the main issues that President-elect Trump had brought up was this issue of rescinding DACA. And in fact, he did deliver on that. Before he did deliver on rescinding the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, Mayor Emanuel joined with a number of mayors to hand deliver a letter in this city to then President-elect Trump, insisting that he doesn't touch the program of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And in fact, he did get an agreement that that program wouldn't be touched. But at the end of the day, in September of 2017, the complete opposite happened. And so it is crucial that we see the different ways that our mayors can play a leadership role and double downing on the values around what it means to be a city of immigrants, what it means to be immigrants ourselves. I think it's a unique space that we find ourselves in, where everyone's sort of exploring, what is my immigration story? Because if we truly are a city, or rather a country of immigrants, then what was my story, or what was my pathway of getting to the role that I am in now, or to the country that I'm in now, or to the city that I'm in now? And since Dr. Colleen, you encouraged us to think about ways in which we can encourage the private sector to support what we're doing, I would say, one, as I mentioned earlier, we need more individuals who have otherwise been at the receiving end of policies and programs to actually be at the table. So in other words, as I'm sure many of you have heard before, is that if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. And most of us have been on the menu. And so that's one part. And I think the other part is that most of our governments don't have a great deal of resources. I think that a number of my colleagues in other cities will say this unequivocally, that we have to be super resourceful about how to do a lot of work. And case in point, I'm a one-woman show, and so I often like to use the pronoun we, but it's really just me. But nevertheless, I mean, we see a great deal of need, and it's only increasing. As Leora shared so eloquently earlier, the public charge issue is going to be an issue that's going to keep us even more busier, informing immigrants of their rights, making sure that they're aware of the full vicissitudes of what's taking place during these policies that are very destructive to the populations that we've worked very hard of encouraging and empowering. So those are my two asks, and I'm happy to share more about that later.
Thank you very much, Seemi, from the city of Chicago. Again, feel free to ask some questions, put your placards up. I'm going to transition into a conversation, since we've heard a few cities, Chicago, New York, others, speak about the importance of coming shoulder to shoulder, mayors, on a number of the principled perspectives that they have, kind of the reframing of the problems, so to speak, alternatives to detention being one, we heard child protection another, and the work that's being done across cities and as we would have it across countries on this topic of immigration, migration, refugee protection, both because they see things differently, as we were talking about. They see things differently often than their national governments do, and unfortunately that's becoming more and more the case across Europe, in the United States, and in many other places. Also because they see the benefits of having an open policy and extending protections to everybody in their jurisdiction, as we heard earlier, but also some of the economic benefits to remaining open and understanding that human mobility is most likely the way of the future. It is something to embrace and for us to understand how to govern and to govern well in an era where cities will become more and more diverse places over time and not the opposite. In other words, forward thinking rather than backwards looking. And with that, we have seen in the last year, as states have come together, as I alluded to earlier, for the first time to try and understand, and I'll break it down because it's always, it's complex. It's framed as complex. I'm not sure how complex it is. It's the first time ever that states are coming together to say, all right, lots of people dying at the border, trying to cross a border, trying to cross a body of water. What can we do so that less people die? What can we do so that our public has more confidence in the way that we're handling when people arrive? What can we do so that our public has more confidence in the way that we handle when people are here and likely to stay here? And how can we strike deals with people in countries from which they're coming to make sure that some of them go back? I mean, it's not cynical, that's what it's about. And so there have been a series of negotiations, and states for the first time have a framework agreement. I say states with the exception of this one, the United States and Hungary, have an agreement that they will endorse at the end of this year in Morocco in December. And it's an agreement loosely defined, the lawyers amongst us. It is not legally binding, but it's a commitment, a statement of commitment by states in terms of this is what we see as the challenges and these are what we see as the opportunities, and we agree that we're going to move forward in these ways. I use that as an introduction to say that during those negotiations of that agreement on migration, an international group of cities have mobilized, led by cities around the table, Atlanta, New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles, Athens. I'm drawing on all of the cities, more or less, all the cities who are around the table, and many others, to say these are some of the main elements that need to be in such an agreement. And they've listed what they see as the reality on the ground. And one of them, coming back to what Mayor Yvonne was saying, has been an emphasis on the fact that in cities, when it comes to the distribution of services, city governments refuse to discriminate between people with different legal status, different categories of residents, for instance, and also legal status in a given country. Now, so that, we all know around the table, that was a non-starter for governments. For governments discussing amongst themselves the issue of distinguishing between legal migrants, immigrants, and illegal immigrants was a source of big contention during the negotiations and even considered a breaking point at times. Having said that, very cleverly, the group of international cities that came together suggested some text, which I think was just incorporated without a great understanding of what was being agreed to. There's some in the audience who may correct me on this. And it was around this language of non-discriminatory approach in the distribution of A, public services, and B, education. That has made its way into the text. So congratulations to the cities that worked on that. Why is it important? Because it reframes, when they look back, it reframes the quote unquote problem, and it sets states to a higher standard in terms of what they were going to accept for themselves, and it's actually the cities that are going to implement. So that's one agreement. The other agreement that I referred to earlier, unfortunately, and some of you will say two agreements, yes, unfortunately, states have embarked on a parallel process for an agreement on refugee protection. It really sounds insane to talk about this in front of this crowd, but there is a parallel process, all led in a different place, imagine all the costs, and the national government has a whole set of people working on this around refugee protection. And so both of those agreements are coming to place. And the reason why I refer to both of them is that we have two cities here that have really been very instrumental in the impact, the influence, and the voice of an international group of cities and making sure that states reflecting some of the local realities. And so with that, I'll pass the floor first to the Honorable Ambassador, Secretary of International Affairs for the city of Sao Paulo, Brazil, followed by the Honorable Vice Mayor of the city of Athens. Please, Ambassador Massot.
Thank you, Colleen. I appreciate and thank Concordia and the Open Society Foundation for the kind invitation extended to Sao Paulo, and I would also like to thank you for such a friendly welcome. Migration for us Brazilians is something deeply rooted and concerns solidarity, because it has to do with the origins of our country. When you talk about migration, we go very far and we have to remember the past. I think that remembering the past, we can be more honest and more present in the actual moment concerning refugees and migrants. Brazil, as many of all Latin American countries, and even the United States and Canada, have been colonies in their pasts. And waves of migrants arrived to my country, first from Portugal, the administration of Portuguese and also Spanish during when the two crowds were together, and then hundreds of thousands of brothers from Africa that came to work in their plantations. Well, this was the pattern during from the 16th century until the beginning of the 19th century or mid-19th century, when slavehood fortunately was abolished. But the populations, they mingled in a very positive way. So Brazil today is a result of this society that was born in America, in our continent. Later, other waves came with their very specific history. For instance, I just mentioned, as a picturesque it is, the head of state of Brazil then in 1876 was a monarchy. Brazil was a monarchy. He was a monarch, an emperor. He went to the Middle East, an improbable trip. Someone, a head of state in South America in 1876, going to the Middle East. And then there he visited Lebanon, he visited what is today Syria, and he invited these people to come to Brazil, such a huge country as we were, and were underpopulated. And they started to arrive. And they started to arrive in waves. And today, the descendants of this immigration represents 12 million people from Syrian and Lebanese descent. Most improbably it began, but today they are everywhere in our country. Even the president of the republic, his father was a Lebanese. When slavehood was abolished, agriculture needed a more skilled cooperation. So immigrants from Italy arrived, and also from Japan in 908. Today they are tens of millions of descendants of Italians, of Japanese, at least 5 million, and from Western Europe after the two wars, waves and waves of immigrants were received with open arms by Brazil. So today we are 200 million, 210 million. Half of this population or more descends, I would say that 90% descends from immigrants. So what is the message of this? It's a necessary message of solidarity. Selfishness has no room in Brazil to deal with refugees and to deal with immigrants. We make no distinction between legal and illegal immigrants. We only try to solve the problem that is created to them after they arrive. And this is our challenge of today. But we have to remember every day of our origins. If we don't remember our origins, we tend to be selfish. Some countries are being selfish in their vision, and this is very wrong. So the first message I want to give here, to leave here, is that we make no distinction between legal and illegal immigrants. Now we have, in the last 5 or 6 years, we had different waves from Haitians. Of course, they had economic and political problems, and also immigrants from Western Africa, and more recently from Venezuela. 50,000 Venezuelans arrived in the last 6 months in a very tiny city in the Amazon, the middle of Amazon, and the border with Venezuela. That city used to have 1,500 inhabitants, and suddenly it had 50,000. Immediately, we are trying to organize how we can, the federal government, the state government, the municipal government, and the city of Sao Paulo has joined strength and forces to try to accommodate these people, and we now have a policy. Of course, we had already, but now a specific policy to try to include this population of Venezuelans who are fleeing deep economic and terrible political crisis also. So this is my first message. Later, if you wish, I can tell about what we are doing concretely in Sao Paulo to accommodate these people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Massot.
My name is Lefteris Papagiannakis, and I'm the Vice Mayor of Athens on Migrant and Refugee Affairs. On behalf of the Mayor Kaminis, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. Let me just point out that for Athens it was very important to be in this process, along with the above-mentioned cities. Athens is not a very big municipality if you compare it to, for example, Sao Paulo or Los Angeles or New York. But for us it was very, very important to be present because we have acquired a symbolic status, if you want. So we took advantage of it and we wanted to push forward on these issues. I'm happy to say that, and I cannot take the spotlight out of the mayors, but I'm happy to say that in December, after a long process and long discussions, we will be presenting a project along with the government of Switzerland, some cities, along with Athens and other cities, and of course the Open Society Foundations. I cannot say any more because we are under embargo, but keep it to yourselves if you can. Just 2 or 3 points from what I've heard. Just to remind you some of the numbers, 68.5 million people have moved, according to IOM last year. From then, roughly 2 or 3% came to Europe. If this is a crisis, I have to ask myself what the countries that are hosting the rest of the 97% are doing. So for Europe, crisis, not so much. And this is my opinion. It doesn't reflect probably the opinion of the mayor, but I think that we cannot speak about a crisis. I'm not talking about a problem because when you talk about a problem, you mention a problem, citizens tend to ask, okay, what is the solution? So if someone has a solution to human mobility, please share it with us. I'm very interested. I know that some likes this part because we are talking about it for years now, the concept of crisis. I know that in some elements, in some areas, for example, children protection, etc., there are issues, and I can talk about them also, because if you mention the detention centers, I can mention Moria in Lesbos, unfortunately. So this is one issue that I wanted to mention. The second one is that cities are coming together because they find obstacles from the national governments. It's not only a US issue, it's a European issue. If you see the political evolution concerning the elections in Europe, it's going very, very badly. We have escaped. We dodged 1, 2, 3 bullets, but we will not make it in the next few years. You can see what is happening in Germany, what is happening in France, what is happening in the Nordic countries, etc., etc. So this is, for cities, this is very, very important and very, very critical and crucial on what they are supposed to do with people who live in their boundaries. Because yes, Athens also does not discriminate. Of course, we have a non-discrimination policy. It's very open and it's very, very clear. But issues will occur. For example, the issues of undocumented migrants. I think that it will be the next big challenge for all of us. We have people who are denied asylum in Athens, and we do not know what to do with them, as a city or as a country. So this is going to be a very important issue. Along with 8 other cities in Europe, we are discussing policy proposals around this issue. Brussels will not be very happy when we present the report, or maybe not even our countries, but we will do it anyway. And the last point is just to give you an anecdote of what is happening around the world. Last week, we received a South Korean delegation of, I think, 20 people from municipalities, region, and government. And they came to Athens to see how are we dealing with refugees in the housing sector, because we have a project with UNHCR housing asylum seekers. South Koreans were very, very, concerned because they saw one morning 150 people from Yemen in their borders. 150 people. When they told me the story, it was not very polite, but I had a smirk on my face and said, welcome to the future, because this will be what we will see from now on. They were questioning how people from Yemen ended up in the borders of South Korea. And I said, again, the same story. It's like trying to stop water. If someone has a solution of stopping people, please share it with us. Thank you very much.
A lot to think about there. And because we are running out of time and we're just going to start our next part, let me give the floor to our speaker on, I'll take one question here from Duarte and another from UNICEF who have asked very quickly. Please ask your questions, and then to do justice to the other speakers, we'll pass quickly to the other speakers in our last part of this session, the second part of the session, which will be on innovations and partnerships. Go ahead, Duarte and Verena, just quickly, please.
Just a quick follow-up question to Mr. Papagiannakis. You mentioned that Athens has dodged 2 or 3 bullets, but you won't dodge the next one. What does that mean specifically?
It was the European elections. I was talking about the result in some European countries. We have, for example, Austria. As you know, the 2 candidates for the presidency was one from the Green Party and one from the extreme right. The Green Party won this time, but I'm not sure that they will going to win the next time. Already the Chancellor is partnering up with a far-right extreme party. If the President also is from the extreme right, then we will lose Austria, if you want. That was, and the same, the elections. As you know, AfD in Germany is number 2 in the polls. In France, Marine Le Pen was in the second round and could almost win. So that was what I was talking about.
Okay, thank you, UNICEF. Let's pass now to some of the partnerships, and we'll come back around. And I'm going to give the floor to the Executive Director of the New American Economy, Jeremy Robbins, who perhaps, Jeremy, you could explain in a few words also what you're doing and the perspective you're taking, your partnerships with chambers of commerce. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thouez. Mike Bloomberg started New American Economy about 8 years ago, really out of this discussion, right? That cities, as Mayor Aki-Sawyerr, I thought, said really elegantly, we walk the streets, right? You see it every day. You don't have the luxury of punting on this issue. And so, especially in an increasingly hostile environment towards migrants the world over, what can you do about it, and how do you know it's working? And so we started a New American Economy, which is a coalition of now more than 500 CEOs and mayors trying to come up with innovative solutions just about what should you do, and how do you know it's working? And so building off a lot of the stuff that New York City has done and continues to do, where we work now in more than 50 communities across the United States, almost all of them in conservative states. And the reality is, and now I'm cribbing from a border senator in our Senate, that the further you get from the border, the scarier it seems, right? Like when you're actually on the ground, dealing with the workforce issues, dealing with assimilation issues, it's actually not nearly as hard an issue to talk about. And so not only are our mayors a good area to start, in some sense, they're the best area to start to work on this. And so what we do, starting in Atlanta with your predecessor, Mayor Lance Bottoms, and now working all over the country, is we've worked with mayors to start task forces where you can bring in the business community, you can bring in the nonprofit community, and there are really sort of four things that cities need, right? They need a message to know how to talk about this. How do you have this conversation locally where it's not a third rail? And we have a team of PhD economists and demographers, sociologists to make a local economic case to even have this discussion. Second is they need a plan. Atlanta has a very beautiful plan on what the concrete things you can do locally, whether it's starting offices of immigrant affairs, as Atlanta has done off of it, whether it's having municipal ID cards like New York and so many other cities now do, whether it's community policing, whether it's figuring out things on education, whether it's not defensive but offensive, whether it's looking at how do we not say, all right, we're not going to try and stop the bad things, we're going to attract the good things. We want our city to be competitive. We want immigrants to come and start businesses here. That's not something to guard against or to manage. That's an opportunity. And so programs to attract immigrant entrepreneurs. And then you need the right messengers. That is not just going to be the mayor, but it's going to be the faith leaders, the business leaders, the university presidents, the people in the communities. And the last, the newest thing we just released in the United States, but I think it's applicable globally, is how do you know it's working? When you look at, I thought Seemi said it really well, about integration is when someone comes to your city and they can imagine themselves being a public servant, right? They can imagine themselves being an engineer or CEO, I think you said. And so we spent a year with the top immigration scholars in the country developing a cities index, so where you can actually look at the top cities in the country and know, are immigrants integrating? Do they look like the native born? What does success look like? And we looked at 51 different sets of indicators, some policy and some economic, where you can really say, all right, what programs do work? What interventions do work? Where do people have access to housing? Where do immigrants have access to health care? Where do they have access to good jobs? Where do they have access to the public sector? Where are they civic? Where are they naturalizing? And the goal is to equip cities like the ones around this table, many of which we're working with, to really lead in this issue, to be able to say, okay, we are going to lead, here's how we do it. And I think that is a huge opportunity area domestically, but also globally, and one where cities, I think LA is doing a phenomenal job of innovating in how do they make their city inclusive in every single way, and one that we're proud to work with and will continue to work with communities around this table. Thank you.
Very much, Jeremy. And so let's pass the floor now to Dr. Linda Lopez from the City of Los Angeles. She's the chief of the immigration office for the city. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colleen, for inviting me, and thank you so much for being here as well. On behalf of Mayor Eric Garcetti, I wanted to say a couple of things on some of the innovations that we've been creating in the city of LA. As many of you have noted, cities are leading the way when it comes to developing programs, when it comes to developing policy, when it comes to developing initiatives. Why? Because we believe that when cities are welcoming, when they're inclusive, that everyone really wins. It's not just the immigrants or the refugees that are a part of the diaspora of our communities, but that, in fact, when we approach it in that way, that everybody wins. In LA, for some of you who aren't familiar with Los Angeles, it's about 4 million people. 40% of the population is foreign-born. And how we approach this really is based on the premise that the richness and the diversity that we have in our community in the cities in the city of LA, that profile really contributes to thinking about immigrants and refugees from the standpoint of being assets. So thinking really in this approach of being able to see that there is value added when we have immigrants and refugees that are contributors in our economy, when they are contributors in the workforce, and other industry sectors that we have in the city of Los Angeles. So today, what I want to do is to focus specifically on one of the innovations that we created in the city of Los Angeles, which we're very proud of. And I think part of the approach here really is how do we bring in the public and private sector in meeting challenges that face cities like LA. One note that I didn't mention is that we have about 1 million people who are undocumented in the county. So LA is it's structured differently because we are a city within a county of 88 cities of about 10 million people. So if you think about it, it's imperative that we figure out ways to address the undocumented population within our region. And one of the challenges, of course, that has come to us from the federal government is increased enforcement. All of you know that. I don't need to tell you that. And for our undocumented population, what's happened is it's created a lot of fear and anxiety, especially because people don't want to go to their workplace. They don't want to send their kids to school. It really impacts their daily lives and their daily experience within the city. And so one of the things that we created is the LA Justice Fund, and I know my colleagues from New York and Chicago and other cities that are represented have begun to think very carefully about what the proper role is of city government when it comes to providing city dollars, in this case, and investing in our immigrant community, seeing that we have all these challenges with people who are being detained, who are in detention centers. And for us, the Mayor Garcetti in particular brought together stakeholders from the private philanthropy sector, from the county, from the city, to address this issue of removal proceedings and deportations. And so that is really the challenge that we're meeting with this fund. The fund is a $10 million fund, which includes private investment from private philanthropy. It's structured in a way where we work with the local foundation partner to assess the organizations that will receive those benefits and will receive the grants. So 17 organizations, legal organizations, were awarded grants so that they can then create capacity and develop the infrastructure required so that they can represent individuals, immigrants in particular, and people who are seeking asylum in their deportation proceedings and who are in detention. I think one of the beautiful things about this partnership has been that we now have to find ways to better work with partners that may not necessarily be the usual suspects, if you will. So for a long time, city governments have invested in a lot of different things like housing or workforce development. And so we see this as an investment that also encompasses bringing along additional partners in the private sector. Right now, we are in full implementation of this program. Lawyers are on the ground representing clients in detention centers or who are in removal proceedings. And more recently, we've expanded this for the children who have been separated at the border under the US government's zero tolerance policy. The need to represent these individuals is great. And I think this model has served to create other models and replication in terms of how we address some of these challenges that we're facing within our localities. The final point that I will make is that I strongly believe that public-private partnerships like this one can be transformational, not only to expand opportunity and access for the individuals who are impacted, but also to create more vibrant, welcoming, and inclusive cities that we're all striving for. And also to defend basic fundamental human rights. I think that's really the premise under all of this is we are looking at this from a values approach and what values are at stake. And this intervention is one example of how we address that and how we meet the demands that are faced by vulnerable populations locally. And the final thing I would say is that we need more private sector investments to facilitate these types of innovations in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Linda. When I met with Mayor Garcetti last week in San Francisco, one of the pieces of conversation that came up that I'm pretty much convinced will be a new frontier, is the conversations between mayors across countries on some of these very practical solutions to the work that's being done. And interestingly, we were just having a sidebar conversation with our next speaker, who is coming from Mexico, from CMR, leading a restaurant group in that country, to hear a little bit more about some of the solutions coming from the private sector. And perhaps also, Joaquín, you could speak about working closely with city government in that endeavor. Thank you.
Sure, Colleen, thanks so much for inviting us. I think the story I could share with the group is an example, a micro example of opportunities that cities have with the private sector to partner up and increase and work efficiently towards the immigration issue. On our end, we are working to receive repatriated immigrants in Mexico and offer them a way to reintegrate to the society. So when I was first presented the program, well, I thought, well, this is great. We have American brands that we operate in Mexico, and a lot of people that are being deported to Mexico come from the hospitality industry, and they know our brands, they know the job, they have the knowledge, they have the work culture. And I thought of it as a brilliant opportunity that there was a classical win-win situation. However, when we started implementing the program and we were talking with repatriated immigrants to Mexico, we have been very surprised to understand the difficulties that these people have when they are deported to their hometowns. Regardless of them being their hometowns or not, we are dealing with people that they don't want to be there. They don't want to face their new reality, and we have to partner up with local governments and local cities to help these people come through the cycle of acceptance, of new understanding of their new reality, which is sometimes really devastating. You know, people that left families abroad, people that have been teared apart from children, and they're being dropped in a country that sometimes is new for them. They had maybe left the country when they were 4 years old, and they're being dropped out when they're 25. They barely know the language, they barely know the society, they don't know the government steps they have to take in order to regularize themselves. So there is a huge opportunity in countries like the one I come from to understand and to see, to take not only a transactional approach, but to really see the person and to really understand what anybody who is faced with this traumatic situation goes through. So at the time, we're launching a program to get in touch with deported immigrants, Mexican deported immigrants, to help them go through the process of facing their new reality and offer them jobs where they can thrive. However, there is a huge process and huge amount of learnings that need to happen, and a huge opportunity to partner up with NGOs and the public sector to help understand what these people go through in order that they can face their new reality and thrive there. So that's my...
Thank you very much, Joaquín. It's really amazing. I wasn't sure, what perspective you take. I mean, here's somebody who operates 140 restaurant chains in Mexico, has no particular background in the subject, right? But for your fellow countrymen and women who are coming home, in a sense, or to a home that in their past, perhaps their parents' home or whatnot, and that you are working on this. It goes a little bit to what Lefteris was saying, that we're all affected, regardless of what sector we work in, the jobs that we do, in one way or another, and perhaps directly and indirectly. There's a comment from Anila Noor. I'll acknowledge that and then pass quickly then to Veyom Bahl from the Robin Hood Foundations. Anila, the floor is yours. If you could just introduce yourself quickly, please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Anila Noor, and I'm coming from Amsterdam. And here I'm speaking on the table from the thousands of people who are becoming newcomers in the overnight. And I am working in City of Amsterdam as a policy advisor. I'm also a member of European Migrant Advisory Board of Urban Agenda, and I'm also a member of Refugee Voices. But last year, my city sent me to work in a factory as a labor market, you know. And I think the problem is that city has the problem to help newcomers who are coming in Europe. They are not taking into the account their talent. They are just feeling that they are a burden on them, and they are turning doctors into mechanics. They are turning engineers into a cook, and they are making them unpaid, cheap workers. And I think we need to think about how to create sustainable solution. I totally agree with Seemi. Like, I learned how to get out from the menu and come on the table, but there are hundreds and hundreds who are stuck there. So we need to work together, and we need to give the chance to the refugee-led initiatives. Like in June in Geneva, we have Global Refugee Summit. We need to support them, and I really encourage private and public sector to work with the organization who are refugee-led initiative, because they are the one who are expert. They are living this reality. So we need them the chance to be on the table with the equal chance to speak and to create the change. Thank you.
Thank you, Anila. Veyom?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Colleen, for inviting me to join this conversation, and to all of you for the incredible work that you're doing around the world. I am a managing director at the Robin Hood Foundation, which is a foundation based in New York City, and our mission is to fight poverty in New York City. And unlike lots of foundations, we don't have an endowment, so we're a fundraising organization, and we raise funds largely from a politically conservative financial services community here in New York City. And yet we are now one of the country's largest funders of immigrants' rights work. And so part of what I want to share with you all is that that conversation can happen, and it can be successful, and that community foundations across the country can be the backbones for your work in trying to support immigrant and refugee integration within your cities. So my role is to talk with wealthy New Yorkers about what poverty is in New York City. And it's not difficult when you show them that 40% of New York is foreign-born, and that 50% of New Yorkers who live in poverty are immigrants or refugees, to say that part of our mission, if we care about our city, is to care about migrants. It's to care about refugee communities. It's an easy conversation to have when you're talking to people who care about data. The next conversation we have to often have is to explain that there is actually a return on investment here. That financial services folks who want to know that their philanthropic capital is having an impact can invest through Robinhood in these kinds of programs because it pays dividends. And we do that by explaining in quantitative terms what it means to take the life of a refugee and give them the opportunity to integrate into the workforce. What that means in terms of their ability to earn, their ability to support their family, the likelihood that their child is going to be better equipped to go to school, the decreased likelihood of homelessness, the increased likelihood of access to primary care. And community foundations like Robinhood are invested in creating that evidence base. So I'll share with you one example of work that we've done in the last 5 years in the hopes that it can spark some conversations afterward, because Robinhood as an institution is interested in supporting other cities and other foundations and understanding what we've been able to do with the partnership with the City of New York and replicate those sorts of models and bring in other players that we've not tapped into nearly as well as we could as well. So that one example is a program called iCare. It began in 2014 when there was, from our perspective, a crisis of Central American children coming to New York City. We receive 1,500 children every single year. Family separation, which happened recently, was in some ways a blip on a longer standing challenge of how to integrate young children who've experienced horrific trauma into our city and to help them find new ways of building new foundations. So what we did in 2014 was to convene the leading nonprofits in the city and the city itself around creating a new service delivery model. So since 2014, almost every single immigrant child who's come to New York City who has deportation proceedings in front of them gets access to a free attorney, gets access to a mental health screening, gets a referral for primary care, and is enrolled in public health insurance and is enrolled in public school. That model exists because this constellation of actors came together to ensure that all the various pieces that were required to provide an adequate foundation for those kids was in place in 2014. When family separation hit, it's that same constellation of actors that are ready to mobilize, ready to act quite quickly. And so we're extraordinarily lucky to have leadership from Mayor de Blasio in the city of New York, but community foundations are also there to be your backbone, to take risk for you, and to evaluate and to demonstrate the impact of the work that you're able to do. And so I just encourage the field to look to us as that resource.
Thank you very much, Veyom. I'm sure that's going to be the source of a number of conversations following the conclusion of this session, which unfortunately is coming up very quickly. So without further ado, I will pass to the Deputy Mayor of Malaga, who's also the director of my former UNITAR, the CFAL Center, one of the CFAL centers. The floor is yours, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you very much, Colleen, and also thank you for inviting us and being here. Well, migration has been a reality for forever, and our cities and my city is been receiving many thousands of migrants that have transformed and shaped. But it's true that we need to find new innovative solution, long-term solution. So now we are working together, the city of Malaga and different UN agencies for this. Malaga, I don't know if you know, is a Mediterranean city, 3,000 years old. We are the largest city closer to Africa in the European region. We've been always a center of migration and a mix of culture. A refugee city, we like to call them new citizens. And we all live together in peaceful harmony. But why we work like this? Because we've been working with the same team for more than 20 years. And last year we hosted a conference. It was the UNCDF conference on migration and cities. And of course we know these facts that you already have mentioned. Thousands of people, more than 15,000 crossing the Mediterranean, more than 500 of them died. More than 1,000 of them arrived to our city also. But our Mayor Latorre, we've been working with the same policy. This policy is a policy based in the cooperation development, it's based in the good governance, it's based in the promoting cultural diversity, religious pluralism, strengthening the conviviality, not just the coexistence, preventing radicalization, and building resilience. So I've been involved more than 21 years with the team doing this. And now with the new CFAL Center, we are training in the Mediterranean. We are developing capacity in the Mediterranean, including the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, and improving inclusiveness in the planification strategies of the different stakeholders of the local community. And we need to think about how we need to do it. I would say in two main fields, in financial instruments, and through the training. So I propose, we've been talking with the different agencies, and we propose that we are going to have a new coalition. We are going to move the program called World Alliance of Cities Against Poverty that is based in New York. Is going to be moved to Malaga. And through this, we want to focus in 5 different fields. Of course, city leadership, like we are saying, because many cities are facing, without enough support, this crisis situation. They have overloaded their response capacities, and many extremist parties have taken advantage of this, extending negative narrative. Also through new governance mechanism, linking global, national, and local municipal policies, enhancing the mayors and their staff knowledge on managing migration and diversity, and promoting city dialogue like this one. The third would be new programs to explore local development solutions with the support of the diaspora. We need to take advantage of these migrants. Many of them want to get help back in their original countries, so let's help them to do it. Fourth, strengthening the UN agencies' intercooperation and facilitating them the leadership to coordinate the projects on the ground. And finally, new projects. We think we should find a new model, as cities, not just camps, where in African region, where displaced migrants and refugees can live for a limited transit period, but where the children have access to health and education and basic services, and when the people can work and not just receiving human aid. So these refugee-safe cities, we hope, could be ensure effective pathway for safe, orderly, and regular immigration back to Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Mayor of Malaga. We have 4 speakers that are on this list, so I'm going to introduce them all and ask them if they could just keep their comments to under 3 minutes. One is from the International Rescue Committee, that's Sam Saliba. Hello, Sam. And then followed by my colleagues from the United Nations, we have the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNICEF, and IOM. So, and then I'll pass the floor to my colleague from Concordia, Hanne, for a few last words. So without further ado, we'll go with Sam. A couple of minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. Thanks, everyone. This is a great panel to be on. As somebody who's focused on urban refugee issues for quite some time, having a forum like this 3 years ago when I first started working on it was not in my wildest dreams possibility, but here we are today. So one of the first things I want to do is just take a zoom out to focus globally, but a zoom in specifically on urban displacement, that is internally displaced and refugees moving into towns and cities. If you think about urban displacement, it's kind of like urbanization in overdrive. It's people arriving with less means and greater vulnerabilities, putting strain on already marginalized neighborhoods as they looked for the same opportunities as everybody else. Quite an issue that a lot of the different cities are dealing with, yes, in terms of migration, but also some specificity in terms of the unique needs of refugees and internally displaced. So for a forthcoming report that the IRC is publishing called Urban Refuge, I interviewed 21 cities in every region that the IRC works in, and as well as some regions that the IRC doesn't work in, to really explore what their city governments are doing. I'm happy to say that New York is included, Los Angeles is included. Of course, Lefteris spared an hour of his time to have Athens included, Sao Paulo is included, Kampala is included, and I'd like to include some other cities. If you guys want to do an interview after this, Chicago or Malaga would be great. And what we found, and not only do we interview those cities, but I think this is crucially important, is that we wanted to include in this report the voices of cities who have historically hosted refugees, not in the past 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, as sort of the attention has turned to municipalities given the politics in Europe and in the US, but cities like Kampala, who have historically hosted refugees over decades and have never really received the attention from the international community, as well as cities like Maiduguri in northeast Nigeria, which is a city that has doubled in population over the past 3 years due to the influx of IDPs fleeing Boko Haram. So that's the sort of catchment that we have with this report. And what we found was that 10 cities have a dedicated budget office or single staff person focused on immigrant or refugee issues. 13 have a long-term plan around displacement, which I think is critically important because cities are thinking in the long term. They're constantly changing and thinking about how they can improve. 12 are working with the private sector. 15 have prioritized partnerships with the international community, but all cities we spoke to, and I want to emphasize this point, all cities we spoke to, including those such as Agadez, Niger, are looking for more collaboration with the international community and with private sectors. 3 have established displacement coordination forums. You can talk to Lefteris about that. His was probably the first, I think. And 9, only of the 21, only 9 are involved in international dialogue, but all want to engage in international dialogue. And I think it's critically important as we move forward to think about not just the fantastic cities that are around here, around this table now and the fantastic work that they're doing, but also how we can support other cities like a Maiduguri, like a Kampala, like other cities that are probably dealing with more influx, I don't really like to use that word, but with greater populations of refugees and IDPs with fewer resources. But that said, there's a few things that are free. And I think it's a really cool thing about city governments is that it's free to welcome displaced populations as city residents. It's free to show solidarity with other cities. It's free to coordinate with other NGOs. And it's also free to share this common ground, not just with the cities in this room, but with the cities that have historically and are currently hosting migrants and refugees all around the world. So we look forward to that report coming out on World Cities Day on October 31st. There's a number of different things that we can look to do both from a practical perspective that we're making recommendations for in that report. Things like longer grant cycles, things like more hyphenations. I think we know more.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you, but thank you very much.
Yeah.
And UNHCR, Mehreen?
Thanks very much. I'm looking at the clock, 1 minute and 50 seconds for the 3 of us in the UN. I think that's really collaboration. Can I just come in and I think it's going to be an institutional pitch, but I think a really important one given the context of cities in the multilateral context going forward right now with the Global Compact on Refugees, but also within UNHCR, what we're planning at the end of the year for the High Commissioner's Dialogue. Very happy to be first part of this panel because of the momentum that's building around cities independently of these multilateral contexts, but specifically because now, as a result of an 18-month process since the New York Declaration, we have a particular operative paragraph in the Global Compact on Refugees which references the important role of cities and municipalities in sharing good practices and building innovative approaches. And I was quite happy to hear that I came in blind, but I heard a lot of innovation already when I walked in and was listening to your inputs. To move the process forward from the Global Compact on Refugees into much more of an implementation phase in the hope and expectation that the Global Compact will be adopted by the end of the year, our High Commissioner has dedicated this dialogue on protection challenges this year to cities, the role of cities in addressing the protection and assistance of not only refugees, but stateless persons and IDPs. And maybe just a tiny word on what the High Commissioner's Dialogue is intended to achieve. It's meant to be more innovative and forward-looking, looking at areas of future policy development rather than really the status quo or where we are at the moment. And the role of cities within this context is going to be what we all know and what I've heard already over here, cities as first responders, cities in relation to reception and assistance, and meeting needs, so access to services, but also cities in their role of building solidarity. But I think the idea is to bring the ethos, the thinking, the sort of genesis behind the Global Compact on Refugees, really the idea of partnerships, building border partnerships and having cooperative frameworks amongst those partnerships and coalitions to the fore when we talk about their traditional roles. And particularly, I think that obviously the details you can find online, and Colleen is going to kill me, the time's run out, but private sector has been highlighted as one of the thematic areas, which is, I think, really important, and how we can look at the role of cities and the private sector in moving this issue forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, UNHCR. So we really have limited time for UNICEF and IOM. Maybe a few words, please, from each, and then we'll pass to Hanne. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's quite humbling to come after so many mayors, and it's probably a healthy way of managing that we have a minute left to try to be super focused. So thanks for the opportunity, and I'll try maybe just to say three things. I think point one is I don't need to speak. I think the issue and the importance of children and young people came up so many times already because that's sort of on the forefront. And that's also, I think, as you mentioned from Robin Hood, that's sometimes the entry point to start a conversation, poverty, discrimination, services, inequalities. That's where often we can still unite. But then the question is, how do we break some of these big political discussions then down into chunk bites of solutions? And I think the issue of detention or family separation, it's actually really then at the local level where a lot of the solutions lie. And I think Athens has led the way on many of these pieces. Let's take a big commitment that is now in the Global Migration Compact around ending immigration detention of children. What does that mean? It means having guardians appointed. It means having reception facilities. It means having the social workers that can actually do the conversation and be the bridge build. It means investing in the outreach teams. So it's at the local level where it happens. Maybe the last point here is, I think it's so reassuring to see that a year later, when this discussion last year was very much about we need to get a seat on the table for cities, I think now we're almost there. The question now would be, what is it that you take to the table? Hoping that you will have the seat at the table in the implementation, in the review, in the follow-up. What is it that cities can take to the table? And I think here it is an appeal, really, given the importance of children and young people. Will mayors and cities be the voice that actually will put the spotlight on children and young people as the area we all need to focus on, the audience and the sort of target population we need to invest in? And then a lot of other things will follow from there. What actions we can take and what we can announce and sort of, will flow from Marrakesh in terms of practical actions. And if you want to find more, we have pulled together examples of some of this, and that's, I think, a few copies available, and we've also uploaded it on the app even. Wow.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Jill Helke, Director of Partnerships at IOM.
Thank you very much. The Mayor of Atlanta began our session with a great quote. I'll give you another one. If you think you're too small to make a difference, you've never spent a night in a room with a mosquito. The mayors have been individual mosquitoes for a while, but they're beginning to swarm. And one of IOM's roles, we see ourselves as helping mayors to swarm among themselves at national level and at global level and with other partners. One of the ways in which we do this is with other partners in the UN in organizing the Global Mayoral Forum. And this has been a 5-year effort, but we're now trying to connect it with the Global Forum on Migration and Development on a regular basis, so that that forum that currently has states, CSOs, and a business mechanism is no longer missing the mayoral and city level element. The importance of all the lessons that you have for one another and that the partnerships can bring is one that I hope that perhaps the reference in the Global Compact to the knowledge platform and the connection hub can help to bring all those things together so that you have access to the different lessons and models, which currently are rather scattered and out there, but not in an indexed and searchable form. Thank you.
Very much, Jill. Hanne, and thank everybody around the table, the honorable mayors, for your attention, kind attention. I'll pass the floor to my colleagues here from Concordia.
Thank you so much. As mentioned, my name is Hanne Dalmut. I'm the Director of Partnerships Development with Concordia. And for those of you who know Concordia, you know we put on a program like this once a year online with UNGA to talk about partnerships for impact. But what we also do year-round is to actively broker or try to facilitate partnerships that can take these conversations forward. So I've been sitting here and in the previous strategic dialogue that we've hosted with Open Society Foundations, wearing my little Concordia hat and thinking what comes next. And I know that this conversation could go on for many more hours simply because we have such amazing experiential learnings around this table and in this room. So we are grateful for the time you've put in. I want to say that there's a session tomorrow that I think would be of a lot of interest to all of you as you're bringing forward. And if we're thinking about the tangible steps that can be made between now and Marrakesh, and as we're speaking more about the Venezuela crisis as well, which has been brought up a bit in this session, there's a session from 2:30 to 3:30 tomorrow that is actively working to bring experts together around specific initiatives that can be done at the municipal level across Latin America, really trying to think about the short, immediate, as well as long-term responses that will be necessary. So if you've gotten a taste here and need more, I just wanted to put that all on your radar. Otherwise, we have amazing resources on the app, like was mentioned, and we are just so appreciative for this set of conversations on this really very important issue. So thank you.
With that, we're going to close the session. Thank you very much.